Welcome back, everyone. For today's deep dive, we're jumping into the world of relationships with, well, you probably already know it. Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus by John Gray.
Oh, a classic. I think everyone's at least seen this book on a shelf somewhere.
Definitely a cultural icon. And we're going to dig into it, see what's held up over the years, what hasn't, all that good stuff. So, got your well-worn copy there, I see.
Wouldn't do it without it. Highlighted, notes in the margins, the whole deal. Ready when you are.
Perfect. So, right off the bat, Gray uses this whole Mars-Venus thing. It's catchy, but is it more than a gimmick?
That's what I wondered too, but he really commits to it. It's not just the title, it's like the whole foundation of his argument, you know?
Yeah, right from the introduction, he's painting this picture of these two planets, totally different, Martians and Venusians, and how they just exist differently. And that's how we see men and women today, he argues.
And I think what's important is he's not saying one's better, just different. It's when we don't get those differences, that's when the trouble starts.
Like trying to assemble furniture from two different instruction manuals. Good luck with that.
Exactly. Now, speaking of miscommunication, I know you had cave and wave highlighted in your notes. Really resonated with you, huh?
Totally. When I read that part, how men under stress go into their caves, I was like, yes, that's it. They go quiet, pull away like they're trying to solve the problem alone in their head or something.
And meanwhile, women are on that emotional wave.
Right? Not internalizing it all, but this surge of emotions, and they need to talk it out, ride the wave till it settles.
And boom, there's the clash. He's in his cave, wanting to be left alone. She's on her wave, wanting to connect. Recipe for disaster.
It's like they're both trying to get to the same place, but on completely different, incompatible vehicles.
Yeah.
But, and I think this is key, Gray doesn't say either one is wrong to do that.
Exactly. It's about recognizing for our listeners that going to their cave is how a lot of men regain control, process stuff.
Like they need that space to recharge, to find their center again.
Right.
Right. And women on that wave, it's not always about needing solutions from their partner. It's more about feeling heard, understood, supported through the emotion.
You got it. Different ways of coping, both valid. But it goes deeper. Even how men and women speak is different, according to Gray.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. He says women use a lot of superlatives, generalizations, especially when talking about feelings, like, you never listen.
And a man hears that and he's like, what? I listened yesterday. He takes it literally.
Total communication breakdown. But then Gray, he's helpful. He gives this sort of translation guide for these phrases. So, you never listen actually translates to.
More like, I'm feeling unheard right now. I need you to really get what I'm feeling, even if you don't fix it.
It's the feeling behind the words. She's speaking Venusian, he's speaking Martian.
And they need that universal translator. And this language barrier, it's not just arguments. Even expressing love, Gray says men and women are on different wavelengths there too.
Yeah, he talks about how men show love through actions, achievements, like slayed a dragon, got that promotion, built that house. Actions speak louder than words.
Whereas women, it's those smaller, more frequent gestures. Picking up the dry cleaning, noticing a new haircut, just being present and listening.
It's the little things that speak volumes in Venusian, right?
Yeah.
He even has, and I love this, a whole point system for acts of love.
It's funny, but it makes the point. Men and women, they keep score differently in love, and misunderstanding that causes so much frustration.
Right, because he's thinking, I took out the trash for a month straight, that's got to be worth something. But she's still waiting on those smaller gestures, the emotional connection.
It's like learning to speak your partner's love language, even if it's not natural for you. Requires effort, observation.
It's about realizing what makes you feel loved isn't always the same for your partner. And that's okay, as long as you're both willing to learn.
Which is where good communication comes in. Sometimes those are the hard conversations to have, but you got to talk about what makes you feel loved and appreciated.
Yeah, it's like you got to get on the same page about what actually says, I love you to each other.
Absolutely. And sometimes that means getting out of our comfort zones a little. You know, Gray talks about this whole thing with men and giving advice, which I know can be a bit of a sore spot.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like the minute I start talking about a problem, boom, solution time.
It's that Martian instinct, right? Problem, solution, move on. But for a lot of women, especially when it's about feelings, that's not what they need.
No, not at all. Sometimes I just want to be heard, you know? Validate that my feelings make sense, not jump straight to fixing it.
And that's where Gray talks about this idea of listening with love, which I think is so important. It's about really tuning in, putting aside that urge to problem solve, and just being present with what your partner is experiencing.
Easier said than done, honestly. especially for, us Martians.
Eh,
But how do you actually do that?
Well, Gray gives some practical tips. Like, instead of offering advice, try just reflecting back what you're hearing. So instead of saying, well, have you tried this?
Yeah.
You could say something like, this situation sounds really frustrating for you.
Oh, that's good because it shows you're listening, not just waiting for your turn to jump in with a solution.
Exactly. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is just acknowledge that you hear them and you're there for them, even if you don't have all the answers.
It's like shifting from fix it to feel it. Instead of trying to change the situation, you're connecting with the person.
Exactly. And this all ties back into understanding those different ways men and women experience and express love. Like they're
Yeah.
speaking different love languages.
Which we got to decode if we want the relationship to work. So Gray talks about how men often show love through acts of service, right?
Hmm.
Like they might not be the best at saying those mushy things.
But they'll fix that leaky faucet, mow the lawn, take out the trash without being asked.
Exactly. Actions speak louder than words. And for women, it's those smaller gestures, those little things that say, I'm thinking about you, or I appreciate you.
Like remembering to pick up their dry cleaning, noticing a new haircut, or just putting down your phone and giving them your full attention when they're talking to you.
It's those everyday things that really add up in a relationship.
Hmm.
Which, speaking of adding up, brings us back to Gray's point system for love. It's kind of hilarious, but I get what he's saying.
Oh, it's definitely a memorable way to illustrate that point. And it highlights how differently men and women often keep score in a relationship, which can be a recipe for misunderstandings if you're not careful.
Because a guy might think he's earned 100 points for taking out the trash for a month straight.
Yeah.
But meanwhile,
His partner's over there like, okay, but what about those little gestures, the spontaneous hugs, the compliments? Hello! It's like they're playing the same game, but with totally different rule books.
and nobody told them. So it's really about learning to speak your partner's love language, even if it feels a little foreign to you at first.
Exactly. And that takes effort, observation, and a willingness to step outside of your comfort zone sometimes. It's about realizing that what makes you feel loved and appreciated might not be the same for your partner. And that's okay. It's about learning and growing together.
Yeah, and that's the key, isn't it? Figuring out what actually makes your partner feel loved and appreciated, not just assuming it's the same as you.
Absolutely. And that takes open communication. Being willing to have those conversations about your needs and really listening to your partners without getting defensive. It can be tough, but it's so worth it.
It's like learning to speak a whole new language, or should we say learning to speak Venusian. But it's not just about the words, it's about understanding the different ways men and women communicate their feelings in general, right?
Exactly. Like we were talking about before, with men going to their caves and women riding the waves, it's about recognizing those different coping mechanisms and respecting them.
Because ultimately, we're all just trying to figure out this whole relationship thing, right? And Gray's book, it gives us this framework, this Mars-Venus analogy, to try and understand each other a little better.
It definitely provides a starting point. But, one thing that comes to mind, especially looking back at this book published back in '92, is how much our understanding of gender has evolved since then.
That's true. I mean, Gray's very much focused on this binary, men are from Mars, women are from Venus.
Yeah.
But today, we recognize that gender isn't always so black and white.
Exactly. There's a whole spectrum of gender identities and expressions out there, so it makes you wonder, how do we reconcile Gray's model with that?
Right, because if we're talking about communication styles and different ways of experiencing love, it's not necessarily limited to just men and women, right?
Exactly. Maybe it's less about assigning Mars and Venus to specific genders and more about recognizing those traits as different modes of being, different ways of approaching relationships that anyone can embody.
So instead of saying, all men are like this, all women are like that, we acknowledge that individuals might lean towards certain Martian or Venusian tendencies regardless of their gender identity.
Precisely. It becomes less about inherent gender-based differences and more about recognizing a spectrum of behaviors and communication styles that we all fall somewhere on.
It actually makes Gray's work even more relevant, don't you think? Because it means anyone can use these tools, these insights into communication and emotional needs to improve their relationships.
Exactly. It opens up the conversation and allows for more understanding, more empathy, and ultimately stronger connections between partners, regardless of how they identify.
And isn't that what it's all about, really? Building those strong, healthy relationships based on understanding and respect.
Absolutely. And recognizing that we all have something to learn from each other, even if we're from different planets. Or maybe especially if we are.
Well said. A great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It's a classic for a reason, and we hope you've gained some new insights into the age-old mysteries of men, women, and everything in between. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.